So I think at this point, maybe it would be good to circle back to the original conversation we had on Facebook that inspired this whole episode. Probably many of our listeners are aware that about a week ago, the Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism, where I've attended and spoken for the last few years, rescinded their invitation to Richard Dawkins, who had been the keynote speaker at the conference, because he had tweeted a link to a video that it was a pretty crass satire video that was basically making the argument that feminist ideology is kind of equivalent or has a lot of parallels to Islamist ideology. So Dawkins was disinvited. And I think there's a number of interesting angles on this controversy, one of which being the rather uncivil tone of the video and whether or not that was inappropriate and, why or why not. But the one that I want to jump in on first is, so a fair amount of the discussion on my Facebook post was about whether the video was misogynist and or racist. And I think now that we've been talking about, attacking issues instead of individuals, I think it can be pretty difficult to separate an attack on an ideology from an attack on people. So, for example, there was a caricature of an Islamist and a caricature of a feminist who was in fact a caricature of a real feminist, although I think Dawkins didn't know that when he posted it. And so I think they were not very flattering caricatures, of course. But I sort of have to wonder what takes a critique of an ideology like feminism or Islamism over the line where it becomes a critique of women or a critique of Muslims or of Arabs. Do you have any heuristics for settling those issues?
So my take on the situation in general, why we disagreed, was about Dawkins being disinvited over it.
Right. Oh, I guess I didn't actually say what our positions were. I just sort of pointed at the issues.
Yes.
Would it be easier for me to just lay out what my original Facebook post said and you can respond
as
you
that'd
did
be great.
On Facebook? Okay. All right. So what I said on Facebook, it's a public post. I can link to it if you want to read it. Which I only mostly agree with now, not entirely. But what I said at the time is, I did not like the satirical video. I thought it was crass and immature and intellectually lazy, and I don't think Dawkins should have posted it. However, I still nevertheless disagree with the NECSS decision to disinvite Dawkins because of the video. And it's not because I think they were censoring his free speech or anything like that. I think, a conference has a perfect right to disinvite a speaker if they feel like he's not appropriate for the conference or for the audience. I objected because I felt like the sort of crassness and unfairness and intellectual laziness of the video was not really any different from the kind of crassness and intellectual laziness that I see in a lot of skeptic and atheist satires and even just blog posts aimed at, say, Christians or homeopaths, or even particular people within the skeptic or atheist community with whom the author disagrees. And so it seemed to me that disinviting Dawkins because the video he posted was crass and unproductive and immature, was kind of a double standard in that that same tone, that same level of discourse seems to be in practice considered fine unless it's directed at, say, feminism. I can talk about how my views have shifted a little bit since then, but maybe why don't you just jump in and say what you disagreed with in that, Dan?
Yeah, so what I disagreed with was, so the first thing is that I do think it matters that Richard Dawkins is not just any speaker. I think that if you invite Matt and Trey from South Park, they represent, or the Charlie Hebdo guys, they are, honest, they're clear about what they are, right? Their credibility is as satirists. They're not as leaders of a movement. They're not as someone who's on the board of one of the most important and powerful secular organizations in the country. I think that the nature of Dawkins's power means that he's seen as the face of the entire movement. when he does things, it reflects on all of us, whether we like that or not. And I don't think it's rational for I don't think it's rational for Dawkins to ignore the laws of human psychology and say, oh, no, if I call it just my personal Twitter feed, then I'm not representing anybody else. I think that that's irresponsible about how he's actually representing everybody. And so because of that, I think that's different. Does that make sense?
I think so, but just to ask a clarifying question, does that imply that if he had posted a video with the same sort of level of tone, but about a different target, say Christians or homeopaths, that it would still have been unacceptable because of his role in the movement, his prominence?
Well, he said things about Muslims that have upset even many people in the movement and that are ostensibly, like he's offended people by saying the Muslim world has no Nobel Prize winners in science, or very few. Like, he has upset other atheists even when he was attacking religion.
But he didn't get disinvited from a conference for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to see him getting disinvited here as sort of, look, it's a threshold issue, right? You allow people a certain number of, if we're going to call them mistakes, I think they're mistakes. You allow someone a certain number of mistakes because they're only human. At a certain point, there's no clear line, right? At a certain point, you say, okay, we're fed up, right? Now, I agree. To me, NECSS, maybe just shouldn't have invited him in the first place. It is weird to do it over one video, but it isn't just one video. It is that finally they took into account the whole history.
Although I think it's possible I'm misinterpreting their position. I think that their position was not that his incivility in general, including towards Christians or Muslims, is that is the thing that has accumulated enough to cause us to disinvite him. I thought it was his incivility in critiquing feminism.
It could be. I mean, well, so let me get to that prong of my argument. So that's a nice setup. So the next prong of my argument was, the other issue is that NECSS isn't trying to bring in homeopaths to their conference. It's not, and it's not trying to bring in pseudoscientists. It's not. It also doesn't represent the values of homeopaths, etc. Whereas I do think that I do think that the skeptic movement is, or should be, part of the humanist movement. And I do think it's fine for skeptic organizations to say humanist values include feminism, and that the kind of vitriol in the video was towards mainstream feminism. I mean, you can say that, oh no, it was about this, it's only about that segment of feminists who are apologists for Islam, even when Islam is harming women. And I agree, that is a serious problem. I am friends with many ex-Muslims, and my heart goes out to them, and I really, really believe that sometimes, I'll give you a great example of this. I got into a big fight on Facebook attacking a kind of feminist who apologizes for Islam when they shouldn't. Like, I was pointed to a video in which a feminist Muslim explained how she wears the hijab completely out of her preference, and it's because she believes that it makes her more dignified to not be a sexualized object. And to me, feminists are, mainstream Western feminism would call that kind of modesty position patriarchal, because it puts the emphasis on women to be the ones who don't get themselves objectified by being more modest. And it puts the emphasis on men being these uncontrollable dogs who, if they see a woman's hair, they will objectify her. I don't think that's feminism, and I don't think just because it's a Muslim woman who's claiming she's being a feminist by saying that becomes feminism. And I do think that feminists have done a bad job sometimes in defending the women in the Middle East against a patriarchal culture, and they've been condescending and patted them on the head. And I think they've put their anti-colonialism, which is a good thing in general, above their feminism. So I think that's valid. But the problem was, this video was lumping in anything related to feminism as inherently this, as bad as Islamism. And it was so crude to be completely alienating to anybody who sees themselves as part of the actual feminist revival going on the internet, that I think these organizations don't see themselves as against and want to have a hospitable environment towards those people, even if there's disagreements among them. There should be that kind of they should be welcome.
Right, right. Yeah, it does. And this is probably a good point to bring up one of the ways that my viewpoint shifted after the long comment thread that followed my original Facebook post, in part because of some things Dan said and a few other commenters as well. I think I can get on board with the idea that there should be different standards for how sort of careful or civil you should be expected to be, depending on what the target of your criticism is. And I haven't worked out exactly what I think those differences should depend on, but I can see an argument for if the target of your criticism is a marginalized group, or is associated with a marginalized group, maybe, or the target of your criticism is something, is a group that could reasonably feel unwelcome in your community or movement because of your criticism, then maybe the standard for civility should be higher, which is not what I had argued in my original post. So that is kind of a shift for me. But the thing that I'm still confused about is whether my disagreement with you, Dan, the original disagreement, is mainly over whether we think that Dawkins posting that video was him satirizing or slamming feminism in general, which I think is I think the sort of core tenets of feminism are really, they're so almost like moral fundamentals, at least in our sort of the humanist community, like the idea that women should have equal rights, and no woman deserves to be raped, and women should be paid the same for the same work, and all, women should have the right to vote, and all of those things. Even if you're civil in criticizing those things, that's still a pretty hostile, that does create a hostile environment for women, I think. However, Dawkins, he is sort of explicitly trying to separate out those core tenets of feminism, which he supports, from the more fringe parts of the feminist movement, like the parts that are, often apologists for Islam and its mistreatment of women. And so I guess my question for you is whether you think Dawkins' fault was in not separating cleanly enough the target of his criticism away from feminism in general, and thereby creating a hostile environment for women, because it felt like he was attacking, maybe he was sort of indirectly attacking by linking to that video, which didn't make the distinction, the sort of basic rights of women. Or whether you think that, no, even if the video had said this is just about fringe feminists, that critiquing fringe feminists maybe in an uncivil way, that sort of justifiably makes women feel unwelcome.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't think he's only attacking a fringe. I think that he's attacking a very large segment of feminists who do think that the kind of feminism that he identifies with doesn't go far enough. Now, I want to be clear, because I'm sure his fans are chopping at the bit right now to mention this. He does say, in linking to the video, that this is not all feminists. In fact, the vast majority don't like that, right?
Exactly.
And okay, I'll give him that. I think, though, the video is not nearly as clear. And Dawkins' hostility is against more than just a fringe. I mean, I don't know if it's. I'm going to bring in a previous tweet. When he writes, "Officer, it's not my fault I was drunk driving. You see, somebody got me drunk." When he's defending, when he's on a rampage because of the about rape accusations, over people being drunk and having non-consensual sex, and calling that rape afterwards, he writes this tweet which says, again, "Officer, it's not my fault I was drunk driving. You see, somebody got me drunk." He's going after there something that I don't think is just a fringe. The idea that that there is rape from women, that people can be raped because they're taken advantage of when they're drunk. And that kind of victim blaming in here, the kind of pattern of hostility here towards positions which are defensible is a problem. And I think the other thing is to call this fringe feminism, the other problem I have with it is that the ostensive purpose of this was to satirize, as I understand it, what was going on in Cologne, where there were a number of sexual assault reports on New Year's Eve, and apparently it was some sort of coordinated, thing by Middle Eastern, people from Muslim descent, Muslim countries' descent. And there was this huge thing in the media. Why aren't the feminists calling this out? Right? It's because they don't think it's rape if it's by a Muslim. That's the joke in that video. Mm-hmm. And I really feel like in that case, what you're looking at is feminists were put. People who were very disingenuous were putting feminists in a bind. They were like, don't you want to, you don't want to pick on Muslims, do you? Yeah. And it's like, no, they're not being hypocrites. Like, if you were in, to be extreme about it, but if you were in 1930s Germany and you found out about some really bad things done by a group of Jews, you don't go and, like, when you know that the Nazis are about to clamp down and commit horrendous things against the Jews, you don't want to stoke a fascist flame. It's a worse consequence if you do that. And I totally understand that no feminist came out and said, well, it's just Muslims, it's not rape. They didn't say that. What they said was, hello, don't use these sexual assaults to stoke the fascist backlash against Muslim immigrants that's happening in Europe and in the United States. And so to satirize those feminists as saying it's not rape if a Muslim does it, as that video said, that's disgusting.
So I guess I want to give you the opportunity, if there's something that we didn't touch on that you think should be said, to introduce, the last thread. But if not, I can just ask you another question.
I just feel like I didn't answer your question well enough. I'll just admit to you, I do think you have a really good point. In fact, when I was looking back at the discussion, I think I remember saying, I don't know how to answer that, and then you brought it up again here. And that point is, what's the difference between attacking a woman and attacking feminism, right?
Right.
And I do think you're right, like, political movements can be skewered. It's not like picking on women. And I guess you could satirize Black Lives Matter without picking on black people, but it would
be tricky to do.
It's tricky.
That is a very, very fine needle to thread.
It's a very fine needle to thread, and I think that one thing I've picked up from the feminist blogosphere is sometimes if we actually look at the latitude we give to our criticism to feminism that we wouldn't give to our criticism of anti-racism. Mm-hmm. We do seem a little bit more forgiving of sexism and misogyny, and I do think maybe that's telling, that we would see a black satirization of black activism as an attack on black people. There is a blurry, it's a similar kind of thing with attacking feminism too carelessly. And finally, the one thing I think I did make a point with you was that it was a real woman in the video. And even though Dawkins in his official thing said, I've scrubbed because I found out it was a real person, he went on to deny maybe she hasn't really gotten all that vitriol she's saying, but I decided to tweet around, to scrub it anyway. Then he congratulated himself because, no one should be harassed, even a vile person like her. Every life matters, even a vile one like her. And it's like, to call a street level activist, and I found that really hypocritical because the anti-feminist side has gotten upset over Twitter storms over powerful people making sexist remarks, like Sam Harris saying, estrogen vibe is not as good in atheism. That's why women aren't, like jokes that are, of course, he was kidding. But the point is, like, these sorts of jokes, the anti-feminist side has not really been kind about, has not been happy about about those people being raked through the mud, people like Sam Harris or the scientist, who said that you don't want girls in the laboratory because they cry and they fall in love with you. Like those guys, they've said, oh, they just pummeled them for a joke, But meanwhile, here's Dawkins being told that there's a street level activist who, of course, I mean, look, she was very uncivil. I hate that video. It's terrible. I don't support her. But she doesn't deserve to be the face of all that's evil with feminism. And Dawkins, even after was alerted about that, started denying that she's gotten any abuse, called her vile. For what? For being an incendiary activist who gets out of control? You mean like Dawkins has been fighting that atheists can be? I find that really problematic and hypocritical for the anti-feminist side, that they are so against witch hunts if it's Sam Harris, but if it's, who can more than take care of himself. But if it's a street-level activist who's on the feminist side, and that's where I think that their claim that they're just about civility and free speech are hypocritical. I'm trying to really chart the course that's really fair to both sides in my civility pledge, and I don't find that side is really that fair to the feminist side. And of course, I know the feminist side can be abusive. They're wrong as often as they're right, I think. But I just don't like when people are taking themselves, wrapping themselves in free speech and declaring themselves the winners, any more than people who take themselves and wrap themselves in social justice and say they're the winners. And both of these sides are not listening to each other because they think they can do no wrong because they're on the side of justice. And I want to actually look at claim by claim by claim. No, privilege is not the end of the story. We have to actually prove the argument's wrong, not just that you're wrong because you have privilege. And no, just saying I have a right to offend is not the end of the story. When you offend, people can actually make an argument that it was a moral reason they got offended and that they have a right against you to get an apology.